Welcome, listeners, to part two of my conversation with Ed Lehman from the Canadian Peace Congress and the Regina Peace Council. This effort is a part of our Music for Peace release, which is currently available on BeatsUnion, Volume 1 and all proceeds go to support the Canadian Peace Congress. This Music for Peace is a part of BU Connect, which aims to connect artists worldwide and music activists to reinstate the principles for peace. Because without peace, what is the place of the vulnerable and sensitive artist? In this episode, we discuss three major principles. The first two are ideologies and the moral narrative. And these two, before an ideology was an ideology, it started with a movement. And if we consider movements and look at the moral narrative, we see that the moral narrative is often at the heart of the movement. So from a religious perspective, a religious history perspective, if we consider Judaism, we see that the moral narrative is at the heart of Judaism, to escape the horrors of the supreme authority and oppression of Pharaoh. And if we consider Christianity, we see that the moral narrative is at the heart of Christianity, to escape the horrors of the false narrative imposed by the occupation. And if we see Islam, we see that the moral narrative is at the heart of Islam, bringing people together to unite around common human principles and reinstate the value of self-sacrifice, because it is the only thing that can usher our unity to face oppression everywhere in the world. And if we fast forward in history to a more modern ideology, considering liberalism, we see that liberalism also has its rightful place in history and its impact in ushering the moral narrative. Liberalism as a movement helped usher what we call today the common human and individual rights, which is the base of the bigger umbrella of international law, to give the vulnerable human being individual rights. And so from that perspective, we celebrate liberalism. However, what we see here is that there is something called moral supremacy. And in that way, liberalism has also been weaponized. And so it is from that lens that we criticize liberalism, reminding everyone that it is the common human and individual rights and international law that brings us all together, not liberalism. Supremacy is the third principle, because we see terms today flying around like white supremacy, which is being used to usher political movements with false pretense of political saviors riding on the back of the working class. But the reality here is that there are many forms of supremacy. We mentioned moral supremacy and the weaponization of liberalism. But we also have class supremacy. We have status supremacy. We have ideological supremacy. So there are many forms of supremacy. It is not a matter of the skin one way or another. And supremacy is a sickness, because no matter how supreme you think you are, human being, you shall always be reminded of your vulnerable and sensitive nature, one way or another, throughout the wise journey of life. And so, in the style of Malcolm X, I tell you, my name is Noor. I am a Syrian-Canadian artist. I am both East and West. I am a Semite, and I am beautiful. And to those who are advocating for war and telling us to go back to wherever we came from, we say to you to go fight and die in your wars of hell. And to those telling us that wars are a necessity to maintain our peace, we say to you, no. It is the lessons that we can learn from the sacrifice of the innocent blood that tells us and reunite us again on the common principle, on the common human experience, so we may once again remember the importance of the common human and individual rights and international law order, because without it, it is jungle law, which is the major problems of what we see today. Okay. So today we titled this session Student and Teacher, or Teacher and Student, in honoring the teachers' strike in Regina. Our education system is in crisis like everything else. But Ed had a big problem with the title, because he had some contention with the teacher-student relationship. He felt that students sometimes learn better without teachers. So Ed, maybe you want to tell me about your thoughts on that before we get going on this conversation.
Well, there's different ideas of what a teacher should be. And in my opinion, the best teacher is what they call a facilitator, rather than a teacher who just lectures to the student and then looks to the student to repeat everything back to the teacher. So I didn't quite like the idea of us being teacher and student. And also, everybody has their own experiences and something to bring to the discussion of what's going on in the world. And it doesn't matter how educated they are.
I completely believe that, man. And I find that a teacher is not very good at being a teacher unless they also become the student. Because if the learning stops, then so does the insight, so does the service, so does everything else. Okay, so we started these conversation after releasing the Music for Peace compilation, and a big shout out to all the artists that were involved in that. And the first session we talked about multiple things, but we were digging into this idea of the common human temple, because we're about divided on every possibility out there. And so today I want to continue on this path and maybe gear us a little bit towards some specific ideas. We talked about human rights there, but before we get to human rights, I want us to think about the word ideologies and think about the word supremacy, the power game, because these are at the heart of what's happening in today's world. Ideology is how we think, and there are many ideologies out there. We were talking in the last session about the unipolar world and how it came with its own human temple, and the liberal idea and ideology was a big part of that temple worldwide. There are considerable problems that I see personally today with ideas that come from the liberal ideology. For example, subjective truth, that there is no such thing as a common truth or a moral truth, that there is only the subjective truth based on everybody's upbringing. But that can be shattered quite fast, you know. But I think that's at the root of what we're seeing today worldwide, because all of a sudden everything is a matter of opinion. War is a matter of opinion, crime is a matter of opinion, genocide is a matter of opinion. Yeah, well, how can you help me understand?
I think related to that, we have to see that we have common interests as human beings. And we have to put aside our differences. And I'm thinking of people who think they're superior because they may have a European background, for example. Or people, because they happen to be born in North America, think they have the right to tell people in other countries how they should live and what is right for everyone in the world. And I think that's very, very prominent in the United States, for instance. And it's just accepted as a matter of course that the U.S. has a right to be the world's policeman.
And so that's a direct outcome of the current power structure that we have in the world, mainly the unipolar world after the collapse of the Soviet Union. And that so far is kind of summarizing what we talked about in the last session. But I want to dive deeper into the idea of power. And you know, we talked a little bit about the liberal ideology and the idea of common truth. How is this for some common truth? And this comes from religious history. I want everybody to realize something, that religious history is simply older history. The meanings are taken, the context is taken, and it's put in studies. You know, it's a matter of the value of language, the value of words, into putting meanings so we can teach them, so we can carry on forward these kinds of meaning. Ancient history from a religious perspective tells us about power. There is a story of Adam and the devil, when Adam is supposed to be taken as kind of the new inspired creature on the planet, and there is a character that is referred to as the devil that refuses to bow and recognize the inspired creature, being Adam. And the words that used back then is that I am made of fire and he is made of mud. How do you expect me to bow to that which is lesser than me? If we look at, especially because of the situation in Palestine and the predicament of the Jewish religion, we talk about Pharaoh in Egypt. Imagine a human being as God. The human believes that he is God. The entire societal structure treats him as God. He is superior and he is reigning on everybody. And try to imagine that kind of character throughout history. What we know about superiority is that it is equated to insanity because it is a false delusion. Once it is localized in such a way, it collapses. And so Egypt as a structure early on collapsed. When we talk about power and also organizational structures, we can look at what happens next, succession of power. Egypt as an example, with the human being supreme God, had to succeed in power in his own lineage. And so succession of power within the family proved to be a complete failure. That collapsed. Later on, these things evolve into other organizational structures, all the way until we reach this level of ideas of institutional democracy or constitutional democracy, right? But we see this idea of the supremacy traveling throughout her history. Specifically, I'm trying to touch this angle about supremacy because we often hear white supremacy, and there are roots for that. But I also think it's a problematic use of language because anybody with white skin seems to attribute that to themselves. And sure, the problem is ignorance and knowledge, but we want to gain a human being no matter where they come from. Can you tell me a little bit about the roots of this term, white supremacy? Because I see it backfiring in so many ways, and we'll talk maybe later on about the rise of Trump in the United States, but maybe even back in time in Europe, about this term, white supremacy?
I don't know the historical so much. I want to go back to some of the issues you raised relating to power. I think when we look at all the great religions, the religions as a whole serve a purpose of backing up whoever is in power. But within all of those religions, there also are those who are questioning of power. So that within the Christian tradition in Canada, there have always been those people, usually in certain smaller churches, that stood for peace. And they were consistent in their beliefs and their actions. When we talk about Judaism, we find the same process. And some of the most outstanding figures in the United States fighting for equality for the Palestinians come out of a Jewish tradition. Mm-hmm. And when we look at Islam, people talk about Islam as if it's one thing and deserves to be condemned. I've heard that a lot. Mm-hmm. But if we actually study Islam, there is maybe even a greater breadth of thinking in Islam than there is in Christianity. Mm-hmm. You know, so we can find many progressive thinkers on many issues from the basis of Islamic perspective.
You know, Ed, I'm an interesting character when it comes to ideologies because I had some concussions and brain trauma that for me to function, I had to find a way to function because I wasn't functioning. And so I tried and I studied. I studied the liberal ideology. It's a very easy thing to have. However, I find that it creates the conditions that a lot of people take advantage of in a bad way. But when we talk about Middle Eastern religion, when I study them and apply it to myself, you really cannot take them one without the other. Because if you consider the Middle Eastern history, you have to consider Judaism, and you have to consider Christianity, and you have to consider Islam as three pacts of Middle Eastern history that still remains today, and that's what really people are dying for, that the values and the traditions and the meaning behind our history is lost, sadly, in this equation. You know, we talk about Judaism. Moses fought segregated power in Pharaoh and presented a moral narrative that created a better ethical reality for the Jewish community, which is what started the path for Moses in the desert and the Jewish faith. In Christianity, same thing with Jesus Christ. He fought power and he separated power. We see this relationship between power, moral narrative, and a new kind of reality emerging, the new human temple as we referred to it in the last session, right? And so let's get maybe a little bit in the closer history. Let's talk about specifically Europe, and let's talk specifically about the rise of Hitler as a segregated form of power. And because we see those problems every time this power is segregated and localized, and it seems that there is some sort of a play that plays around that gives this kind of character some form of narrative to justify that kind of existence, as if some sort of a person is going to come and save society. And that's not how you form organization or society, but that's a good start at least to tackle it.
Well, I think I'm going to use that nasty word, capitalism. Under capitalism, we're led to believe all the time that individuals have all the answers. And all we have to do is find the right individual to lead us, and everything will be okay. The reality is we need movements of people. And yes, it really helps when you have very bright, talented individuals as part of those movements and helping lead those movements. But it's a movement that has a primary role to play.
So what about movements that have a leader, like a character like Hitler back in history? Society was organized on a movement level to justify something called the nationalist, socialist type of idea or ideology. Can you give us a little bit of background? You told me once before.
I mean, with Nazism, there always was a scapegoat. And we know the first scapegoat was the Jewish people. But 100% of the gypsies were killed at Auschwitz. Heather and I were there and we saw the stats. And the Nazis did a very good job of preserving the pictures of every person they killed. And there were many, many other groups other than the Jews who were killed. They especially focused on people who were left-wing thinkers, either socialists, communists, trade unionists. All of those were targeted by the Nazis, even though the Nazis pretended to be a working class party, just as Trump today is pretending to be a representative of the working man, and some working people have fallen for that kind of idea. And also, with Trump, there's a question of racism. So Trump is against, especially people who are coming into the United States, and he focuses on the illegals. Not facing up to the fact, not asking the question, why are those people in that position of having to come to the United States? What did the United States do to their country? That's never answered. What did the West do to all those countries that people now are forced to leave? They were impoverished by North America. And then when people try to come to North America, quite often, of course, they're condemned and called all kinds of names. And I'm sure our Mr. Poutine will do likewise in Canada if he hasn't already.
And a question in Europe after World War I, right? The conditions were created almost in Germany to usher the justification for the socialist, nationalist identity to emerge. Am I correct? Do we see some similarities of these conditions back then that were in Germany to justify the rise of Hitler? The same kind of conditions are existing in the United States today to justify the rise of the National Socialist identity?
Again, I would say it's very hard in the United States to form effective social movements. So, while in Canada we have a large percentage, for example, of workers who are unionized, in the United States, they're very small, maybe 5% of the workers belong to a union. And then I could ask the question, well, how effective is that 5%? But it's very hard if you're in a workplace in the United States to form a union and to have some rights, because things are stacked in the direction of the corporations, and the political leaders are mainly there, most of them, to serve and are on the payroll of corporations. So it's no big deal there to have members of the Congress receive bribes under the table. That's quite a normal situation.
So is a good definition for fascism some sort of a ownership between corporations and government without the working class people or the civic movement, as we were trying to allude to here in the past two sessions? Without that civic movement, just corporation interest and government?
Yes, and the use of raw power.
Okay, so the idea here is to try to get to the core of the issue, and that is to realize what constitutes an independent individual, a human being, right? Is a human being poor and vulnerable? Surely. But with education, we can understand a little bit more and become stronger. I think the idea originally in religions in the Middle East is, in the core, a tool of separation of power. There were talks in the past about what would constitute a good source of power. What would be an ultimate source of power? Because we can see that no matter what organizational structure we create, a king or a pharaoh or an emperor, it all seems to collapse. We need something, and it seems to collapse because of corruption that is caused by the power itself, right? We're giving too much power to individuals. Today, we have something called materialism in capitalism, which is power in material, power in money, perhaps, right?
Yeah.
So how can we have effective working institutes if money is the highest power? I mean, it's known criminals are the best at galvanizing the most amount of money, right? Because if I work, I wouldn't look at, I want to make as much money as I can and I want to rule the world. I would look at how I could give a service, and I think that's the premise of the working class in general, right? Yeah. So how can we have effective institutes when money holds power, you know?
Well, we need all kinds of public organizations fighting for people's needs in different areas. One example is, I think we need a strong housing movement across Canada, because too many people are being forced to live in accommodations that they cannot afford. And in the recent period, many people are living in situations where The landlord came one day and just arbitrarily raised the rent $500 or $1,000. And the person who was doing okay before and paying their rent on a regular basis now is, in many cases, having to move from where they were. But there isn't always anywhere to go to. So across Canada, it doesn't matter now what province you're in, what territory you're in. There are many ordinary people who are homeless.
So when we talk about collapsing empire, and that is the unipolar world, generally what happens, it's funny, I'm an entrepreneur, and the first thing people tell you is the problem is you because you're not used to abundance. And so what happens when empire is collapsing and it's on retreat is abundance goes out of the window. And so the rich naturally will want to protect their money, and there is less circulation in society. And so now we see Canada, when we see Canada is in debt, in trillions of dollars. Who's in debt? It's the working classes, the people. Right? The people that power the government, which is in debt. So we are enslaved to the debt, and that gives the power to the corporations, because it is the only source of money that could potentially pay the debt or etc. Is that a good assessment?
So if we do an economic study of where people were 40 years ago and where they are today, very large percentage of people have had their cost of living jump, but their paychecks or salaries just were increased a little bit. So before, you could raise a family quite well if one person was working. Now, if you don't have two people working at good professional jobs, you're going to really be struggling financially. And the other thing is, it's becoming much harder for people who before were professionals or small business people, because small business people are also getting the squeeze. They're getting the squeeze from the big business. And when you're a small business person, I was a small business person for a while, your costs aren't controlled by yourself. Your costs are controlled by somebody else, because no matter what service or goods you're providing, you have many expenses. You have your overhead to look after. And you have vehicles, you have to put gas in your vehicles. And really, you may think you're your own boss, but somebody else is really calling the shots when you go to pay your bills.
I mean, everything is going to go up. From the perspective of corporations, also supply line chains are struggling. Everything is struggling. So the corporation itself is not sustainable anymore. So again, we get to this organizational structure. But I think this is a good entry to talk about empire and the rise of empire. Because, see, we're not living in the days of Pharaoh. We're not living in those old days. We progressed. And I think one of the mandates of the Peace Council is that the world has enough tools to create peace and prosperity for everybody.
Yeah, so I may have mentioned last time that in the peace movement, we used to use the slogan, guns or butter.
Who?
Guns or butter. With the idea being that either we're going to continue putting money into the military machine and continue raising the military budget, as Canada is doing, no matter what the Conservatives say. In fact, last week, the federal Liberal government raised the military budget by over $8 billion. That was a very, very big jump. Well, that money's got to come from somewhere. And either it's going to come, like Noor was talking about, out of the debt and make the debt a whole lot bigger. And it means some social services are going to be cut, or certain needs will only be talked about. Like now in Saskatchewan, we see in our classrooms where there's supposed to be classroom assistants helping students. Many times now, there's no classroom assistant, or they're expected to help 5 people when one child is very high needs and needs all of that help himself or herself.
Yeah. So to me, it's like it's again on this idea of organizational structure, because democracy for the ignorance ain't gonna work, and I think that is already evident. We have a problem with education because it keeps the nation ignorant. When we claim to have a democracy, I mean, how is history teaching in Canada? Not very good from what I've seen and what I heard.
Yeah.
And so we have the claim of a democracy, but we lack the education, so it's democracy of the ignorant. And so I just want to get to this point, Ed. So we had something called the United Nations, international law, human rights, and at some point, somebody decided to break that. And the point why I raised Trump as an example, because Trump was the first person in his administration to start undermining the international institutions. I mean, there's many scandals to look at. The most relative one is the OPCW and the chemical weapons claim in Syria. But it was the Trump administration that threatened the leader of that organization and his family. They wanted reports to be written in a certain way, and coming down to this idea of power and corruption of power. And if they don't do these things, then the money is cut. And when the money is cut, then the International Institute now goes off balance, and surely somebody else is going to come and fill up that void, mainly China. And then they can use that also as a narrative for war to say, these institutes are run by China, right? They effectively did this. They effectively collapsed the world order as it was and ushered this idea of empire that we're seeing that is causing everything else, from the collapse of the supply routes, from everything going downwards. And then you have this politics playing that somebody is going to win and save everybody along the way, right? But the reality is it's collapsing because we're not a good organization anymore. I mean, democracy is there, so we don't have power and corruption as you have in dictatorship and other forms of governance and other form of organization, right?
Yeah, so I think quite often governments would prefer the populace to be ignorant. You know, they would prefer having citizens who don't have the ability and the words to ask questions.
So why is that?
And just before I get to that, I want to tell a little bit of a story. I recently had a letter to the editor published criticizing NATO. I did not expect to get some of the response I got. Some of the response I expect to have debate. I expect people to write me and say I'm wrong. But I got all kinds of accusations of being naive, and in the same letter, being dangerous. Dangerous. And then I got told I should go to Russia if I'm going to criticize and question the Canadian government. And I worked up at least 4 old men from different parts of the country who made a point of writing me, but really were trying to shut me down. Even while they were praising to the skies that we live in a wonderful democracy. So I think we also live in a time of great hypocrisy. And we have people who benefit from the hypocrisy because we have military corporations, not just in the United States, we have them in Canada too, including in this province. And war is good for their businesses. It may not be good for anybody else's business, but it's good for their business. And if you're a career military man, you need wars to be going. And it doesn't matter, what the issue is, who was right, who was wrong. You want to be able to go and get more stripes on your shoulder.
And so everything is truly related, you know. Talk about, by the way, I already started getting some weird stuff happening as well since joining the peace movement, which Ed has told me about. So, which, you know, it's almost like you have to play mind games with yourself and consider it an honor. You know, it's a badge of honor when you get attacked for raising peace. And quite frankly, I mean, if discussing peace has become so problematic, then what the hell is the point of doing anything at all? And I say this to anybody who's listening to this who would have a problem with us discussing peace. But, you know, coming back again to organizational structures and segregated power, etc. When we have something called the United Nations and international law and human rights, the primary purpose of such a thing, come on in, please. The primary purpose of such a thing is to overcome the past. Let's go back to the Pharaoh time and realize what kind of an environment it used to be. When the Jewish people came up with the statement, eye for an eye, there is a purpose for that, because it was eye for an eye everywhere. And if you're going to make a statement, it has to be eye for an eye, because the human being lacked the understanding to collaborate, to surpass, to think about morality, to think about transcendent value and transcendent meaning, and find common prosperity with other human beings. When we go to Christianity, we see a step up in the moral narrative as well. When we go into Islam, we see the return of eye to eye. However, the high definition of Islam gives you so much knowledge also about the higher standards of ethics that are being ushered. But fast forward to today, we have the human rights, we have the international law, we have United Nations. These things are related. They're not coming from arbitrary, you know. Islam refers to the human being as you, the human being. Fast forward to human rights, you, the human being. So the human temple is very important. We need to maintain these things and always be on their side, because otherwise we become a force of regression. When we look for wars and superiority and such a things, we become a force for regression. International law gives us a framework in order for us to manage ourselves internationally. It's much better, because if we don't have that, what are we going to have it? If we don't have a framework internationally, we're going to have this jungle law that we see today.
Well, then we have another term that's used, the rule of law. And what the rule of law is, the United States feels it has the right to dictate to the rest of the world. So really watch out when you're seeing that term rather than international law, because they're two totally
anybody can write any law and start feeling that they want to enforce
different meanings.
Yeah.
And there's also, like, what we have today is multipolarity. And you know, we had a situation where the US was calling all the shots. Well, now other countries are stepping up the plate and saying, we want some say too. And some Americans, and I'm actually in a debate with one of them now in a journal, the Americans don't like, many Americans don't like this rise of multipolarity because they understand it really means that they're not going to have, and they're not having, as much influence in the world today as they did before. To give one example, it wasn't long ago that many people in the Western countries were totally on the side of Israel and would not support the Palestinians. Now we've had a flip of opinion where probably a majority of people are sympathetic to the Palestinian cause. I know that's true in Canada now. A majority of people are sympathetic to the Palestinian cause. And now our challenge as concerned citizens is to get our politicians on track. Although within some of the parties, like the members of parliament, are now sympathetic to the Palestinians, but the elites that are running the political parties are saying and punishing people who dare speak out. And that happened to a young woman in Ontario who is a MLA who is now forced to sit as an independent because she had the courage to speak out very clearly in defense of the Palestinians.
On that subject, there was a time, see, knowledge is a beautiful thing. It's the only thing that enlightens the long, dark tunnel of ignorance, right? Long time ago, the studies in the United States, being a pragmatic country of institutions rather than ideologically driven only, saw or foreseen the rise of China. And it has been 30 to 50 years of tackling that issue. The wars that we see around the world are very related to this fact. Today is no longer the rise of China. The economical numbers are out. China is already number one. Welcome to the new multipolar world. There is no changing that. China is number one, United States is number two. These are the current numbers. Russia is above Germany in Europe. You can thank Trump for that. But the main point here is that also when we look back at history, we're going to use religion again because these were major form of organizations. Judaism had a certain wave with it. It was unstoppable after a certain level of organization. So did Christianity, forcing the Roman Empire to adapt to the Christian faith because of the numbers and the power that it had in it. And so is the case with Islam. That was a wave that was rising up. Today, the wave of multipolarity is unstoppable. Other than that, you can expect a world of supreme authority, which, you know, everybody has weapons and everybody has technology, and this is why superiority is insanity. This is why you gotta love your enemy. Maybe you'll learn something good for you. You know, maybe you'll learn how your enemy thinks and you learn something along the way. But if you think you're supreme, you're supreme, you're supreme, you better keep that up. And when you don't, well, you know, things like what's happening to Netanyahu currently happened, no?
Well, I think in the United States and Canada, we have to catch up with the rest of the world. Everything has changed except our way of thinking. We're still thinking in the Stone Age. We're still accepting the arguments that the way to have security is to have more weapons, to have bigger stockpiles of weapons. Every time there's stockpiles of weapons, they're for a reason. They're to be used. And eventually they do get used. And it's very dangerous to continue stockpiling and to have that military buildup as the strategy that we think will bring us security. If we really want security, we have to support ceasefires and negotiations and the signing of peace agreements. And the world has done it before, and that's what we need with the situation with Ukraine and Russia. Ukraine and Russia, 2 years ago, were sitting down together, working on a peace agreement, and Boris Johnson of Great Britain intervened on behalf of the United States and told Ukraine, no, you cannot do that. You cannot go down that road of working something out. We also need a peace agreement between Israel and the Palestinians. And that's the only way the bloodshed will stop. It doesn't matter who you think is right, who you think is wrong. Eventually, just like with Ireland and Northern Ireland, you know, you can talk hate all you want, but at the end of the day, you have to be able to talk civilly enough to the other side to sit down and work something out in the interest of both parties. And the world needs that because we're in a very dangerous spot right now in the world. We may not realize it, but it would be very easy for this conflict between Israel and Iran to blow up into a regional war. And if there develops a regional war there, it would be very easy for it to turn into a world war.
You know, one thing about the new wave that is being built on the sacrifice of the innocents in Palestine, and we better give him a salute, because the sacrifice of the innocent is precious blood, yo. So this new wave, you know, even though we're talking about problems in the liberal ideology like subjective truth, and many see this as a subjective matter, genocide has become a subjective matter, which is pathetic. But the truth is, the wave, the unity on a human temple that is rising up has the conservative, has the liberal, has the LGBTQ, has you name it. That is beautiful. That is an opportunity that is created by the blood of the innocent to give the world a new chance, to give international law a chance, to give human rights a chance. These are the creme, they are the results of the hard works of humanity throughout generations and generations. We must protect them. So the first thing in the common human temple is to realize that international law and human rights are beautiful and wonderful things. And for the liberals, I want to make a clear statement. Realize that you have your rights for extreme individuality because of human rights, not the other way around. Not the other way around, right? So today, a chance for solidarity. I think it's available. What else can we do, Ed, in Canada, let's say, at least, to bring this a little bit more to the forefront?
I think whenever there is a peace action, we should find a way of supporting it. And not everybody's going to go on the streets, I understand that, but there is always some way of acting in solidarity, even if it's telling your friend about why they should take a position for peace, or educate them about what is going on with the Palestinians or other places in the world, what is going on, say, with Sudan, or, there's many hot spots around the world that we need to educate ourselves and then inform others of what is happening in the world. Because our problem, one of our biggest problems in Canada, is our media does a very poor job of informing us. So you could read Leader Post religiously every day from one end to the other, but you still won't be able to even ask the question. It doesn't even help you ask the questions that you need to frame, let alone give you the answers to what is actually going on in the world, because the mass media is a corporation too. They're all corporations, and they have a great vested interest in the lies that they get us to believe.
A part of my way of thinking for the revival of democracy, because I've been in Canada for 23 years, and I attest that this country is beautiful, regardless of its ugly history. The ideas of democracy are wonderful, but it can't be democracy of the ignorant. When we talk about such concepts like revival of the human being and the human temple and the common human temple, guess what? Every institution falls apart because of the failure of the human being. Countries fall apart because of the failure of the human being. False idols and fake leaders that we have today rise to the top, and they caused the failure of the human being because they gave people false hope, And so when we talk about the revival of the human temple, that is a domino effect that potentially could revive the institutions. The human being must stand up for principle. If you are in police, if you are in whatever institutes that we have in Canada, because the next level of this collapsing path is the collapsing of institutions. And then the mafia wins, eh?
Yeah, and I think we have to see democracy as if it is a machine. And with every machine, you have to keep it well oiled at a certain point, or it breaks down. So the only way we can have a really functioning democracy is by speaking up, by engaging in political discussion, and encouraging others to be involved citizens.
That's right. And today I would like to announce live on YouTube and here as well that there is a diplomatic mission for BeatsUnion and the artists and what we're trying to do with music. Because at a basic level, we are reinforcing the human temple and the revival of principle and the human being via music simply by taking a stance, by making a choice. But also at a different level, we're offering the opportunity for artists to come together and give the world a new example of an organization built on concepts of sovereignty. So today we talked a little bit about the dangers of segregated power and the corruption that it causes and the collapse that it will result in the end. There is another way around this, and we're trying to solve that with BeatsUnion, is to give a new type of institution to the world. So it's an open invitation for artists worldwide who would like to join us by joining the BeatsUnion movement. You're also participating on the possibility of showing the world what a successful model of a new type of organization looks like. Because a part of the reason why we have institutes collapsing, sorry? Somebody say anything? Oh. A part of the reason why we have institutes collapsing today is because fundamentally they are built on the wrong principle. I think it's quite clear to say that if institutes depend on the funding of a few without principle and without organization, then we see the collapse of it. All somebody has to do is remove the money, because investors are going to say, hey, I'm paying into this institute. I want to see the return. And when I don't see it, I can just pull out back the funding. That's a fundamental flaw in every institute in Canada or elsewhere in the world, right? But is there such a thing as institutes for the people, built by the people, with a hard work and actual collaboration? Or is capitalism actually truthful to say that without the segregated wealth of the top class, there is never going to be a chance for the people to build a scrap?
Well, many countries are finding their own way to create a more just society, independent of the Western powers. And that, when we use that term multipolarity, there are many former colonial countries. Some are trying to build socialism, and some are not there yet, but they're trying to build up independent economies and find a way of being a sovereign nation. And I'd like to go back a moment to the cultural figures. I think we should thank Noor for the excellent cultural work he's doing and wish him lots of success in it.
Thank you, Ed.
Historically, there were many important scientific figures and cultural figures that assisted with the formation of the World Peace Council in 1949, 1950. And I'm thinking of people like Albert Einstein, Pablo Picasso, J.D. Bernal, Madame Curie. There were many of the best minds of the world at that point, and they were called all kinds of names in our wonderful free media for what they did, and none of them retreated from what they did and said, oh, I wouldn't do it again, I did something wrong. No, they helped form the World Peace Council and they stood by it. And as a result of their work, we're able to exist as a peace movement today, although we're way weaker than what we need to be. And that's why we need everyone to help find ways of strengthening the peace movement.
That's right. And the moral narrative comes from us, the civic society.
Yeah.
And when we usher the moral narrative, we give the opportunity also for the ruling class to make the choices themselves as free beings to support the right things.
Yes.
But if the moral narrative is missing, then there's nothing to support. And here lies the problem. So I think the responsibility is ours at the end of the day, Ed.
Yeah, and I could report specifically that there was reasons beyond economics why the Diefenbaker government opened up trade with China. Because Saskatchewan farmers understood they can make money, and they made millions from those sales, but also they wanted to work with the Chinese. There was reasons why under Prime Minister the first Trudeau, that Trudeau decided he would make a trip around the world and do something for peace, because he knew that would help make him popular at a certain stage. And there have been many figures I could point to. Tommy Douglas, a very important figure in the New Democratic Party, premier for 17 so years, was one of the first to sign the Stockholm Appeal to ban the bomb. But every time those politicians acted, it was because the civic society that Noor talks about compelled them to act. Mm-hmm. It doesn't go the other way around, unfortunately. There's very few leaders who really lead. Usually the leaders are the ones who have their nose to the ground and can smell the coffee and say, okay, I better move on this or that because there's pressure from down below. So our challenge, because we have very little leadership coming from the top on the question of peace, is to provide the leadership from the bottom.
Mm-hmm. That's right. Thank you, Ed, so much for doing this with me again. And yeah, you know, civic society, principle first. We got to usher it one by one. We're doing it. You got to do it too. And in no time, we can fix this. Because what's needed today is true organization and true fruits to be bared by our collaboration and work together. Nothing else is going to fix it. Let's not buy any delusions of any false idol leader that's going to come down from the skies, nor let's not buy any delusions about supremacy and the insanity of supremacy. The new world is here, multipolarity is here, and as was in the day of Trump, somebody said, we got to get used to a world without the United Nations. I think it's time for us to say, no, we got to get used to a world with United Nations and start discussing Canada's place in that world. And each one of us as true, sovereign, independent individuals on principle and contribution to a healthy democracy. All right. Thank you, Ed, so much.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. All right.